Good morning, and thank you for joining this online virtual service of the First Unitarian Church of Alton on the 6th day of June 2021. I am Joy Heft, and I serve as a worship associate and am also the pianist for this church. We are a small lay-led congregation located in Alton, Illinois, on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. Due to the pandemic, our services have been virtual. Past and present services can be located on our church YouTube channel. We hope to see you at our Castle on the Hill sometime soon when we can return to worship together face to face. In the meantime, we welcome everyone to this virtual home of comfort, spirit, justice, and hope. We are Unitarian Universalists. Last month, we heard about people who influenced Unitarianism, Transcendentalism, and Humanism in America from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Today, we will look at the other half of our faith, Universalism, and the people who were influential in bringing the faith to what it is today. We begin our service with a prelude. Let This Be a House of Peace is number 1054 in our teal hymnal, Singing the Journey. This song was written by UU musician Jim Scott and inspired by Kenneth Patton, who we will hear about later in the service. Michael Tacy is given permission to use his video.
Let this be a house of peace, of nature and humanity, of sorrow and elation. Let this be our house, a haven for the healing, an open room for question and our inspiration. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be a house of freedom, guardian of dignity and worth held deep inside us. Let this be our house, a platform for a free voice, where our sacred differences here shall not divide us. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be a house of peace. Let all in this house seek truth, where scientists and mystics abide in reverence here. Let this be our house, a house of all creation, where works of art and melodies consecrate the atmosphere. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be our house. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be a house of prophecy. May vision for our children be our common theme. Let this be our house of myth and lore and legend, our trove of ancient story and cradle of a tender dream. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be our house. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be our house. Oh, let this be a house of peace. Let this be our house. Let this be a house of peace. Let this be our house.
If you have a candle nearby, please join me as I light my own. And recite these unison words for our chalice lighting by Gary Kowalski. We kindle this light in celebration for the life that we share. In time of our offering, we offer the gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving. We need each other, and in times of trial, we need each other even more. You can mail your gift to the First Unitarian Church, Post Office Box 494, Alton, Illinois 62002. Or you can give electronically by searching for the First Unitarian Church of Alton on the Giblify app or via the link on our webpage. As well, you can give through PayPal if you prefer. Give what you will, for you are a generous people. If you know it, please join me in our offering prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. Please join me in singing our first hymn, number 134, Our World is One World, in the Gray Hymnal. Kenneth Patton's view of New Universalism was of a universal religion made for one world, and one that would touch the lives of all humanity. We have two readings today. Our first reading is by Jose Ballou, number 705, in our Gray Hymnal. If we agree in love, there is no disagreement that can do us any injury. But if we do not, no other agreement can do us any good. Let us endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. Our second reading is by Clarence Skinner, from his book titled A Religion of Greatness. This reading comes from the chapter on racism and is presented as Skinner wrote it without changing the male gender references that were common preference at the time. In 1945, Skinner offered his vision of the message that the Universalist Church had to present to the world. The religion of the unities and universals is a radical cure. It gets down to the roots out of which prejudice grows. It digs into the soil of man's selfishness superstitions, and distortions. It destroys the vicious partialisms which was lock men into the divisive cells of race, denying them common rights of humanity. This enemy must be routed on every front: economic, social, biological, and cultural. The only way to rout it is to supplant the fears and errors of partialism by a vigorous, realistic religion of universalism. For every denial, we must make an assertion. Man must enlarge the borders of his consciousness to include the human race. We must think, feel, and act in universe terms, and thus see how petty and sinful are the partialisms of our lesser selves. We must welcome differences because life in a varied world is richer than life in uniformity. We must recognize the rightful place of color, shape, and history in a syncretic culture. If we, quote, see life steady and see it whole, unquote, we can appreciate all the parts. The parts become misunderstood only when we see it without relationships, as an end to itself. One race is no more necessary than one kind of tree or one kind of horse. Each has its own genius, and each may contribute to a life that is rounded, divine, and complete. It is time for greatness. There must be a religion for greatness to meet the need of the time. Universalism developed in America during the 18th and 19th centuries. In 18th century America, Universalism was defined as a liberal Christian theology that referred to the idea that every human will be saved in a religious or spiritual sense. Universalists believed that salvation was for all men and women, and held that all living beings will attain complete universal salvation. Whereas Unitarianism attracted the upper class and elite, Universalism attracted the lower status society, such as wage laborers and the poor. Unitarians and Universalists were in agreement that Unitarians viewed that man was too good to be damned. Universalists viewed that God was too good to damn men. Universalist congregations tended to be more independent and not prone to having a large centralized organization to keep them together. They tended to meet at state conventions, and these seemed to have more authority than national conventions. The first Universalist General Society was held in 1778 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. By the 1830s, the Universalist Church was reported to have been the 9th largest denomination in the United States. The Universal denomination had 3 divinity schools to teach and bring in more ministers. The Rider Divinity School at Lombard College. It was the seat in which the Universalist institution was in Galesburg, Illinois, and founded in 1853. When the college closed in 1930, the Lombard charter was transferred to Meadville Theological School in Chicago. They combined institution became Meadville Lombard Theological School. The Theological School of St. Lawrence University. The Theological School of St. Lawrence University was founded in 1856 in Canton, New York. The school closed in 1965 with the consolidation of the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association into the Unitarian Universalist Association. A notable graduate from St. Lawrence University is Olympia Brown. And Crane Theological School of Tufts University. The Crane Theological School was a Universalist seminary at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, founded in 1869. It was one of 3 schools founded during the 19th century. The school was one of the associated schools of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences from 1903 to 1962 and 1965 to 1968. The school was never officially denominationally controlled, nor was it accredited by the American Association of Theological Schools. The Universalist Church of America involved itself in several social causes, generally with a politically liberal bent such as abolition, women's voting rights, separation of church and state, the ordination of women, and education reform. In reference to abolition, the Universalists, along with various other denominations, vigorously opposed slavery and thought of it as immoral. In 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act. They also favored legislation after the Civil War, such as the 15th Amendment and the Freedmen's Act, which was to enfranchise all American citizens. In regards to separation of church and state, along with the Unitarians and other American religions of the time, Universalism had been amenable to church-state separation. Baptists, Universalists, and Quakers provided some of the loudest voices calling for the disestablishment of the government-sponsored churches of the Standing Order. Another social reform that the Universalists heralded were women's rights and the ordination of women. The Universalist denomination was one of the first in the United States to ordain women ministers. Antoinette Brown was ordained by the Congregational churches in 1853, and then Olympia Brown became the first woman minister in the Universalist denomination in 1863. By 1920, there were 88 Universalist women ministers, the largest group in the United States. Spiritualism was not necessarily a social cause or reform, but became popular during the 1800s. Spiritualism is a metaphysical belief that the spirits of the dead survive after the mortal life, and can and do communicate with the living, especially through a person, a medium, who is particularly susceptible to their influence. There was a belief that all reality is spiritual. As a denomination, the Universalist Church never fully embraced spiritualism, but many Universalists were sympathetic to this 19th century movement. Spiritualism was fairly commonly preached for some Universalist pulpits in the mid-1800s, but some ministers left the denomination when their spiritualist leanings became too much for their peers and congregants. Please join me in our next hymn, Light of Ages and of Nations. of the people we will talk about today who are important in furthering the Universalism in America were George de Benneville, John Murray, Eleanor Winchester, Jose Ballou, Abner Neeland, Olympia Brown, Clarence Skinner, and Kenneth Patton. One of the most important early Universalist evangelists during the 18th century was George de Benneville. He was born in 1703 in London, England. As a teen, while serving as a sailor, he traveled around the world and began questioning his religion and comparing it to other world religions. George shed his Calvinist religion and began developing his own ideas about Christianity. George de Benneville became a preacher while still in his teens. He believed that, quote, God is absolutely good and in his love would never condemn any human to eternal damnation, end quote. He believed that humans had a dualistic nature. The outer flesh and blood person is subject to the evils of the world and may choose to do good or do wrong, while the inner person, spirit-like person, is crafted by God and is perfect, immaculate, holy, and cannot be damned. Therefore, all human beings will experience salvation. George also studied to be a physician. While preaching in France, he was imprisoned and sentenced to death, but then reprieved by King Louis XV. De Benneville studied to be a physician while in Germany and began practicing medicine around 1739. He emigrated to America in 1741 following a wave of German immigration and settled in Pennsylvania. There he practiced medicine and preached and was an early advocate of the doctrine of universal salvation in the American colonies. Benneville spread Universalism among the German immigrants in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. George de Benneville is remembered for arranging and translating the German religious book about Universalism, The Everlasting Gospel, in 1753, so that more Americans could be able to read about Universalism. De Benneville spent his old age practicing medicine and sharing his Universalist beliefs. When he was 88, he wrote, quote, "My mind is still set to preach the gospel," end quote. His health remained good until 1793 when he died of a stroke. His preaching tours in Pennsylvania and New Jersey in the mid-18th century would help prepare the way for the ministries decades later of John Murray and Eleanor Winchester. John Murray was born in 1741 in England to a strict Calvinist household, and then moved later to Cork, Ireland. He became a passionate preacher in Ireland and returned back to England to join John Relly's congregation, a Universalist Welsh minister. Murray immigrated from Ireland to the United States in the 1790s and is often considered the father of Universalism in America. On his travel by ship to America, his ship ran aground off the shore of New Jersey. Thus Murray had to go ashore there. He only had taken his Bible with him and went to look for food when he met Thomas Potter. Mr. Potter had built a meeting house for Universalist discussion groups in the woods 10 years earlier and had been looking for a minister ever since. Quote, "I have been expecting you a long time," as Potter greeted Murray. Murray was somewhat taken aback and initially refused Potter's invitation to preach, insisting he would be gone by the next Sunday. He eventually agreed, so on September 30th, 1770, near to what is now the Murray Grove Universalist Retreat Center in Lenoka Harbor, John Murray preached his first sermon there. He stayed there at Potter's Universalist Meeting House until about 1774, and then left for New York. Instead of New York, John Murray settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts, as a minister for the First Universalist Church in America. His beliefs involved the rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity and believed in God as one, indivisible first cause. He also believed in a personal devil and of orders of angels. In 1786, John Murray was supportive of separation of church and state, and the Universalist Church won a ruling by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court regarding freedom from taxation. This set an important precedent for advocates of separation of church and state. Murray also served as a chaplain in the Revolutionary War and as the minister of the Universalist Society of Boston. His fundamental doctrine as a Universalist was that Christ literally put away all the sins of the world, but distinguished between universal salvation and universal redemption by fixing degrees of punishment that would be inflicted before the final judgment. After all, the whole world would be saved. John Murray is often referred to as the father of American Universalism, helping to found Universalism as a denomination in the 1790s. Ellen N. Winchester was born in 1751 in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was ordained as an American Baptist preacher in 1771 and a revivalist turned Universalist who helped spread Universalism through the United States. Nearly 40 years after George de Benneville translated the Everlasting Gospel, Ellen N. Winchester found solace and grace by the book and began to believe in universal salvation. Winchester was increasingly troubled about slavery. In 1779, during a revival meeting, he preached to both white and blacks, one of which was the first to share the gospel openly with slaves. After being invited to preach to another white and black church in Philadelphia, the Baptist Church excommunicated the whole 100-member congregation in 1781. He then went on and founded the Society of Universal Baptists and preached at the University of Pennsylvania for 4 years until a meeting house was built on Lombard Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He then traveled to England to found a Universalist church in London in 1793. He emphasized scriptural texts that affirmed that universal salvation would be assured for the entire human race. When Winchester returned to New England in 1794, he became a moderator of the Massachusetts Universalist Convention. In 1796, he returned to Philadelphia, where he welcomed Joseph Priestley to the American shores and shared the pulpit with him until he fell ill with tuberculosis. He died at the age of 45. Jose Ballou was born in New Hampshire in 1771 to a father who was a Baptist minister. Jose was self-educated and devoted himself early on to the ministry. In 1789, he converted to Universalism, and in 1794 became a pastor to a congregation in Dana, Massachusetts. Jose Ballou was an American Universalist minister, theological writer, and a Freemason. He preached that those forms of Christianity that emphasized God as wrathful, in turn hardened the hearts of their believers. Ballou rejected all Calvinistic and Trinitarian beliefs and had been called one of the fathers of American Universalism because of his beliefs during the 18th century. As a theologian writer, Jose Ballou was one of the greatest 19th century American Universalist leaders. He wrote about 10,000 sermons as well as many hymns, essays, and polemic theological works. In his A Treatise of Atonement, published in 1805, his writing converted most Universalist ministers to a Unitarian view of God, an Arian Christology, and the view that because sin is finite in nature and all of its effects will be experienced in this life, all of humankind will be saved after death. Later in life, Ballou abandoned his Arian belief in Christ's preexistence. Jose went on and founded and edited the Universalist magazine, later called The Trumpet, and the Universalist Expositor. Along with John Murray, Jose Ballou has been called the father of American Universalism. He is different in that he's sometimes called an ultra-Universalist, and that he removed every trace of Calvinism from Universalism and opposed legalism and Trinitarian views. Jose Ballou preached at several churches on the East Coast, but served as a pastor at the Second Universalist Church in Boston from 1817 until his death in 1852. Abner Nealon was an American evangelist and Universalist theologian who advocated many views, religious and social, which were considerably extremely radical for his day. Abner Nealon was born in 1774 in Gardner, Massachusetts, and was the sixth of 10 children. He went to school for a year, then his formal education stopped, and he and his older brother followed his father's trade in carpentry. Abner also taught school and wrote a spelling book. At age of 27, he joined the Baptist Church in Vermont and began preaching. He resigned from preaching because doubts of his faith and religion, and went into the dry goods business. In 1816, his good friend Jose Ballou, a prominent Universalist preacher, brought him back to the ministry, and within 3 years, he was converted to Universalism. He moved into a parish in Philadelphia in 1818 and energetically led the church, published sermons, editing newspapers, compiling a hymnal, translating the New Testament, and developing a new system of spelling. Soon he fell under the influence of utopian socialist Robert Owen and began to adopt then radical ideas about social reform. Ahead of his time, Nealon publicly advocated for such unpopular social reforms such as equal rights for women and blacks, interracial marriage, birth control, divorce, and the rights of married women to keep their own names and property. Nealon's theological liberalism and free-thinking social views became too much for his Universalistic parishioners, and it came as no surprise when in 1828 he was voluntarily disfellowed by the New England Universalist General Convention. In December of 1833, The Investigator, a local magazine, published a letter Nealon had written declaring that he did not believe in the Universalist concept of God. He denied being an atheist, but instead called himself a pantheist, which is a doctrine that equates God with the forces and laws of the universe and nature, as well as the toleration of all gods of different creeds or religions. Due to his very public stance of these issues and questioning of the existence of God, Nealon was put in jail 5 times for blasphemy, because at that time in history, that line of thinking was not allowed in the United States. The first 3 times ended up in hung juries, and the 4th he spent 60 days in jail. After that, Abner moved to Iowa, where he started a utopian community called Salubria. He died on August 27, 1844, and the community failed soon after. Thus, Abner Nealon clearly merits remembrance. He pioneers pantheism in early America. He spurred freedom of religion and the advanced social reforms that benefit countless lives today. Olympia Brown became the first Universalist woman minister in the United States. She was involved in women's rights movement and went on to form the New England Women's Suffrage Association. Olympia was born on January 5, 1835 in Michigan. She was the oldest of 4 children, and her parents were farmers. Her parents were the great aunt and uncle, respectively, of U.S. President Calvin Coolidge. Education was very important in the Brown household, as Brown's mother encouraged Olympia to finish high school and advance to the university level of her education. Her first college experience was at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, where her excitement lessened as she found the restrictions placed on women unacceptable. She left there and attended Antioch College, where she also found forms of discrimination, even though it was supposed to be known for its progressive nature. But she was able to press on. After her university schooling, Olympia decided that her calling was to become a minister. With much rejection, she was finally accepted to the Theological School of St. Lawrence University. While there, she again faced much opposition from many sides, but she took it all in as a challenge and was finally able to finish her degree. Despite finishing her degree and gaining a year of experience with several congregations, Brown continued to face opposition to her ordination. She appealed to the Universalist Council, and the board agreed with her, as they had heard several of her sermons. So on June 25, 1863, she became the first fully ordained woman minister in the Universalist Church. Her first call as minister was at a church in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts, where she was formally installed in July 1864. She was there for several years and then went on to pastor a church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, despite the congregation initially being reluctant to hire a woman pastor. In 1878, she accepted the call to church in Racine, Wisconsin, where she continued to serve until 1887. Olympia Brown had always been aware of the quest for equal rights, and due to her strong speaking skills and belief, Susan B. Anthony sought her involvement in speaking up for women's rights. During that summer, she delivered more than 300 speeches and then returned to her ministry. She continued, though, to dedicate her life to women's suffrage. Olympia Brown went on to found the New England Women's Suffrage Association, leading the Wisconsin Suffrage Association, and then becoming the president to the Federal Suffrage Association from 1903 to 1920. Olympia Brown's last march was at the 1920 Republican National Convention. After all of her hard work, Olympia lived to see the day when women were given the right to vote. The 19th Amendment would finally be ratified on August 25, 1920, marking the first time that Olympia, along with other countless women, were able to vote. Olympia Brown died on October 23, 1926. Universalist ministers have been preaching in the Washington, D.C. area from at least 1827. By the late 1860s, Universalists began organizing a permanent church. The Universalist National Memorial Church, UNMC, was established to serve as the official representation of the Universalist Generalist Convention in the Washington, D.C. area. In 1921, Universalist congregations supported the construction of the Universalist National Memorial Church, located at 1810 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., to serve as the official church on the Universalist Church of America. Construction began in 1925 and services began in 1930, with its current congregation continuing to follow the liberal Christian and Universalist principles. It is now a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which merged in 1961. Please join me in singing our next hymn, What is This Church?, from the Unitarian Universalist Musician Network Songbook. The words describe what Universalists believe and feel about worshiping in their church. The tune is Finlandia, also the tune to number 159, This Is My Song, in our gray hymnal. Clarence R. Skinner was a minister, writer, and social activist. He was widely regarded as the most influential Universalist of the first half of the 20th century. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1881 into a Universalist family. His parents and brothers were Universalists, and his grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-uncle were Universalist ministers. Skinner received his BA in 1904 from St. Lawrence, which was a Universalist university. While considering following his cousin and uncle in an acting career, he decided to become a Universalist minister, becoming ordained 2 years later. Clarence served several churches from 1906 to 1914 when he accepted an appointment as professor of applied Christianity at Crane Theological School of Tufts College. He wrote several books that had substantial influence of Universalists in America in the 20th century. In 1915, Skinner published the book The Social Implications of Universalism, which was an interpretation of the social gospel that went beyond the scope of Protestant Christianity. It offered an optimistic socialist vision of the kingdom of heaven to be established here on earth. This new theological view of universalism inspired a new interpretation of the church's mission and established Skinner as a major spokesperson for the denomination. During World War I, Skinner was attacked for his pacifist views, but was staunchly defended by the dean of the university. After the armistice, he again was attacked for his advocacy of a socialist new world order. And once again, the Crane Theological School of Ministry backed him up for his right to free expression. He was terminated from his part-time ministry at the Medford Hillside Universalist Church, which he had used as a working laboratory for his students. Clarence Skinner became deeply disillusioned and discouraged about the state of his country and his church. The United States at that time rejected liberal idealism, as well as the membership into the League of Nations. The Universalist denomination was declining at an alarming rate. The religious movement for social and economic justice, the social gospel, was all but dead. In spite of all this, Skinner managed the strength to go on. In the poem, In Times of Disillusion, he wrote, "I'll still proclaim the vision splendid, till it strikes God-fire in old and broken hearts, and urges on the world to consummate its dream. God's unsurrendered, so am I. Therefore I will live communicate with hope. I light the candle and I dream." In 1920, Skinner put his vision into action. He created the Community Church of Boston, which was an all-inclusive membership and had no denominational ties. The community church was modeled after the Lowell Forum, which included a sermon followed by an open forum for questions, comments, and discussion. It usually had outstanding speakers in its pulpit, such as John Haynes Holmes, who traveled to Boston to preach once a month. The church's statement of purpose was simple, calling for a free fellowship of men and women united for the study of universal religions, seeking to apply ethical ideas to individual life, and the cooperative principle to all the forms of social and economic life. With Skinner's leadership, services were held in rental halls with attendance rising over 1,200 people. The church was deeply involved in many social causes, including aid to the Republican government of Spain and the right of Margaret Sanger to publicly advocate for birth control. In 1933, after the previous dean retired, Clarence Skinner became dean of Crane Theological School of the Ministry. Although he was in administration, he was also a master teacher. Through his leadership and tenure at Crane, the school's faculty and student body both grew in size and diversity. By 1938, there were 54 students from at least 5 different denominational backgrounds, as well as increasing the faculty to 13, but bringing with them a broad range of talents and interests. Skinner was basically a mystic and a Christian who had an understanding of Jesus' teachings as the active and socially effective virtues of love, cooperation, and brotherhood as the true redemptive forces. His theology was centered around mystical creative power at the center of the whole universe, evolving law and order on a majestic scale, which could lead men and women to transform this old earth into the kingdom of heaven. With universalism growing beyond just the faith of Christianity, it was promoting all faiths of the world, or the concept of the universal as one world religion. The church organization known as the Universalist General Convention since 1866 changed its name to the Universalist Church of America in 1942. Despite their efforts, the Christian identity continued to decline in both Universalism and Unitarianism. This spurred ministers like Kenneth Patton, who introduced the concept of new Unitarian Universalism, not as a form of Christianity, believing only in universal salvation, but as one world religion coming out of Christianity and humanism, and the incorporation of equally religious truths from all the world's other great religions. This notion is continued to this day among many mainline UUs. Kenneth Patton was born in 1911 and died in 1994. He has been identified as one of the major poets and prophets of the contemporary liberal religion of Universalism. He was also a voice for poetic naturalist humanism at a time when most humanists were defining a religion of reason. The minister and scholar David Bumbaugh has summed up Patton's work. Quote, "It was he who taught a monotone rationalism how to sing. It was he who taught a stumble-footed humanism how to dance. It was he who cried, 'Look!' and taught our eyes to see the glory in the ordinary." End quote. In 1949, after years of declining membership, the Universalist Church of America was attempting to reestablish itself. It sought new change in programming, a fresh base for Universalism in Boston, through the formation of the Charles Street Meeting House. Its goal would be to develop a message that would move the denomination beyond its conservative Christian orientation, as it sought to reach towards a new universalism. Brainerd F. Gibbons was asked to address the Universalist General Assembly meeting at Rochester, New York in 1949. While fully aware of its Christian heritage, many equally sincere Universalists maintain that an inherent spirit of inquiry has carried Universalism beyond Christianity. A new type of Universalism is proclaimed, which shifts the emphasis from universal salvation to a religion that describes Universalism as boundless in scope, as broad as humanity, and as infinite as the universe. Is this the answer to Universalism? A religion not exclusively Christian or any other brand, but a synthesis of all religious knowledge, which passes the test of human intelligence, a truly universal religion? End quote. They would need an exceptional leader. The superintendent of the Universalist Convention of Massachusetts called on Kenneth Patton to move the project and message forward for new universalism. Patton was known for his excellent writing and preaching skills, and sought to make the new universalism come to life, and push out the new frontiers that lie ahead of him and his fledgling congregations. The Massachusetts Universalist Convention was not only putting their finances on the line, but their reputation too. The Charles Meeting House experiment was controversial from the start, from creating new worship materials and hymns to resigning architecture and worship space to changing the religious focus that had been previously Christian-centered. Kenneth Patton was up to the job. Patton saw the Charles Street undertaking as a natural progression in the evolution of Universalist movement, as well as religion in general. For him, with his intuitive, naturalistic, mystical, humanist world religion view, it was necessary for these steps to be taken in order to further human understanding and growth. In the summer of 1948, renovations began inside. The pews would be rearranged to face 4 banks toward the center, so they would be facing in a circle, representing a compass, to reflect a microcosm of the universe. Patton was seeking to create a welcoming congregation, and one that lived by the principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. He viewed the church as a sacred place for the exchange of ideas and for expressing in the open and wide variety of opinions. Patton had sought out symbols for his universal religion. For him, it was most important to connect religion with the reality that humans experience, the universe, and the atom. In 1949, Patton redefined the meaning of the word universalism, bringing in the arts of all religions and cultures into a religion for one world. In his understanding of universalism, Patton had grown beyond the confines of the Christian and the theological boundaries. Patton's philosophy of religion was both universalistic and humanistic. It centered on the concept of the one world. His most ambitious project was a book titled A Religion for One World, published in 1964 by Beacon Press. It gave an in-depth account of this experiment in universal religion with lavishly illustrated photographs. Music was to be of great importance to the formation of the Charles Street Meeting House. Patton knew that congregational singing could have a positive effect in creating a community atmosphere there. He attempted to draw on music sources, both ancient and modern, to give a full expression to the experience of the universalism that he aspired to. Traditional hymns and readings were not sufficient in Patton's view. As he stated, quote, "It was not so much that I was against theistic hymns and readings, but these materials simply do not convey the emotions, insights, and aspirations that humanists seek to express in their services," end quote. Patton went on to create the ideal for an open hymnal, where he searched and explored new materials to use for worship, believing that the society was no longer limited to whatever happens to be in a hymn book, and that each society could collect and use other hymns, readings, and other elements adapted to its particular choosing. Patton himself was a prolific writer and contributed to the liberal religious cause and spiritual literature, thoughts, and reflection, as well as in the hymn books. In 1964, after the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America, Patton worked with others to commission the first new hymnal for the newly merged association. It would reflect the new approach that would be taken by the Unitarian Universalist Association, using tunes from the best hymnic sources of the past, reviving some of the excellent American folk hymn tunes, such as Foundation, Salvation, and Wind Hymn. It also brought in textual sources from a variety of non-Christian religions, as well as setting some new texts to familiar tunes. The new hymnal, entitled Hymns for the Celebration of Life, introduced many contemporary Unitarian Universalists, including poet John Holmes, Frederick May Elliott, Edwin Buehrer, Vincent Silliman, and Kenneth Patton. The works also include hymn texts by such authors as Ridgely Torrance, Robert Frost, Jan Struther, and Rabindranath Tagore. Hymns for the Celebration of Life reflected the inclusion of such texts from world religions such as Be Ye Lamps Unto Yourselves, which was attributed to Buddha, and All Within Four Seas from Confucius, and Give Me Your Whole Heart from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita. Hymns for the Celebration of Life included new topic sections, in which there were 36 theme sections in all. Death, evolution, science, social justice, the democratic way of life, world peace, the arts, the freedom, were just a few themes included in this hymn of life. There were a total of 327 hymns selected. 13 were authored by Kenneth Patton. Out of 231 readings, Patton authored 30. Selections by Patton can be found under the topics of celebration and praise, the arts of man, and here and now. Kenneth Patton's hymn, Man of the Earth, Upright and Proud, is his most clear statement of religious humanism and might even be called the anthem of humanity. Lastly, Patton gives us something in which we measure our success by when he states, quote, universal religion is worldwide and humanity-wide, end quote. For Patton, this was the ultimate goal. This was the spirit behind the work he sought to undertake at the Charles Street Meeting House. When his professional endeavor in the ministry are reviewed, this was the thrust of his efforts. Patton, in all he did, attempted to forge a faith that would be as broad as the heavens themselves. He fashioned a religion for one world, one that would touch the lives of all humanity. From the Stone Age to China, through Palestine to Western Europe, the legacy has been handed on. The people of Asia and Europe have shared a connection. From the cradle of human civilization in the Middle East to the islands of the Pacific, the message has been passed along to any ears that would hear. Patton was a true citizen of the world. I would even go further and state that he was a citizen of the universe, which shows the depth of the thought that can touch the stars. Our last hymn is Kenneth Patton's Anthem for Humanity. Please join me in singing number 303, We Are the Earth, Upright and Proud. It will be played through once. I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for emails from the church office. They are the best way to keep up to date on announcements and updates at First Unitarian Church of Alton. You may also check our website, newsletter, and Facebook page. Please contact the church office if you have an event or announcement that you would like us to share via our Church This Week email. Look out for next week's service, in which we will continue to explore UU history with the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America into what we now know as the Unitarian Universalist Association. And now, if you have a lit candle or chalice near you, I invite you in joining me in extinguishing our chalice and repeating these words. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. We have heard about universalism and how our early universalists believed in a loving God and that universal salvation would be assured for the entire human race. They believed in the advocacy for social reforms such as equal rights for women and blacks, interracial marriage, birth control, divorce, and pacifism. Universalists believed in a free fellowship of men and women and for the study of all universal religions, as well as applying ethical ideals to individual life, which leads to a religion which was not exclusively Christian or any other brand, but blended the study of all world religions into one universal faith. Our closing words are by Kenneth L. Patton, titled, We Exclaim and Roar, We Are, from the UUA Worship Web Library. Our task is to be who we are, in every way we can be, our salvation proceeding and putting ourselves back together after each tumble. We iridesce, shine, and radiate. We exclaim and we roar, we are. Look out for next week when I talk about the merger between the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America and what our faith looks like today. Please enjoy listening to our postlude, Boy Ya Ya, hymn 1020 in the Singing the Journey hymnal performed by Liam Morris and the Unitarian Universalist Silver Springs Choir.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going, but we know we will. We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know we're there, we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know we're there, we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. We are going.